in the 2 new years that are indeed relevant in the context of this event. While many things remain uncertain, it is no surprise to anyone anymore that economic, technological, social, political developments in China, also its rapidly changing global footprint, and especially US-China and China-Russia relations, will continue to have a profound impact on European interests. From Europe's competitiveness to its security and resilience, what China does and it does not matters tremendously to us. Continuity or more of the same would already provide significant challenges. And if you add the speed of developments, including, for instance, in the space of technology controls just over the past weeks, but also the potential for disruption to this equation, it makes this humble exercise of trying to think ahead even more worthwhile. The usual caveats obviously apply, and China's economic trajectory might be one of the best reminders for that. It is not wise to simply project linear trends into the future. So it is a good tradition that we not only present you with findings from an annual survey that we conduct on the direction China is taking in Europe-China relations, but have also again assembled a fantastic lineup of speakers to discuss what matters most for Europe-China relations. We'll start with a keynote by Nicholas Quanstrom, Managing Director for Asia and the Pacific at the European External Action Service, but also 2 panels on political, economic, and social trends in China, as well as the impact of US-China relations, including on European China policy. We're very proud to do this again with a fantastic media partner, Politico. Thank you for the excellent cooperation. This is live streamed. It is also recorded and will be available on YouTube. We are also grateful for the support received for this exercise. This is part of a Horizon Europe funded project dealing with a resurgent China and the fantastic consortium efforts related to it. And most importantly, and this leads me to action on your side, we are very glad to have you joined today, as we will also request your input and views to warm us up for this important conversation. So if I can ask you to pull out your mobile phones or use your browser to access menti.com. You see a code here on the screen. This will not disappear, don't worry, and answer a few questions that I would like to launch in the coming seconds. Pausing here quickly to let you get ready, but let me now switch to the first question and looking ahead at your responses. On which trajectory do you see China in 2025? A powerful China, China becoming more influentially, politically, economically, plateauing China, a stagnating China, or peaking China after decades on the rise, the country entering a phase of gradual decline. And we have a mix of results here. First response set is the most sought after, and would like to move on to the second question. What do you think, how much the Chinese economy will grow in 2025? Again, 3 response options here: less than 5%, around 5%, above 5%. So quite in contrast to the previous slide, we have a greater uncertainty about the long-term growth trajectory among colleagues answering these questions here. And moving on to the third question, what do you think, how will China's foreign policy develop in 2025? This time we have 4 options. Will we see a return to self-confident, if not overconfident, wolf warrior diplomacy? Will we see a strengthening of relations with European countries or an enhancement of cooperation with non-Western partners? Or will China focus on domestic issues and reduce its involvement in global affairs? A very clear response pattern here is emerging. clearly the focus is on enhancing cooperation with non-Western partners. Now, final question before we head into the discussion. How do you expect the relationship between the US and China to develop in 2025? 3 response options: improvements, no change, and an expectation for further escalation of tensions clearly is the priority in terms of the assessment in this virtual room today. Thank you for that. I think this was a good warm-up for all of us preparing for the coming almost 2 hours. It is now my honor and pleasure to welcome Niklas Kvarnström, the Managing Director for Asia and the Pacific at the European External Action Service, to this room. Niklas is a distinguished and seasoned diplomat hailing from Sweden, where he was not just running the Asia department before moving to Brussels, but is really one of Europe's leading experts on all things China, someone who does not only need to get China right in theory, but has to deal with the implications of it on a daily basis. Niklas, it's an honor to have you here. The floor is yours. Please help us kicking this off with your perspective on EU-China relations in a shifting context. What are priorities? What are challenges that Europe faces in navigating this critical relationship? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikko. Just to check that you can still hear me. Good, good.
Very well.
And thanks for setting the bar there for what's expected of us in the EU, but it's true as well. Well, I shall start by saying thank you so much to MERICS, not just for inviting me to this, but also for your consistent and extremely valuable contribution to the importance of the discussion on China in and with Europe. And I want to say Happy New Year. I guess soon enough it'll be, Xin Nian Kuai Le and Gong Xi Fa Cai and so on. Year of the Snake. I think I understand that's Xi Jinping's zodiac, if I'm not mistaken. So that's interesting itself. Let me do what I'd like to do. I'll just do 3 things. One, I'll say a few things about the context of the EU-China relations this year in 2025. And then I'll say a few things about the current dynamics of our relationship. And then just a few things on the EU's approach to these challenges, to the situation. So let me start with the context and zooming out to the global level. I mean, it remains a very, very challenging world. We have persistent global challenges. Clearly, the challenge of climate change, biodiversity, poverty, and frankly, growing income gaps and growing divides between the developed and developing world. We see rising protectionism in many places, sort of inward-looking trend, and of course, really outright challenges to the international multilateral system and including economic coercion. And frankly, as President Ursula von der Leyen put it, we see the threat of a sort of a league of authoritarian states and perhaps, an alternative international order based on redrawn maps, imperial ideas, and spheres of influence. It's something that really should worry us as democracies. We see serious conflicts in contravention of the most fundamental principles of international law, not least right at home in Europe with Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, which is an existential threat to our security in Europe and also to the European Union itself as an open project for democracies in Europe. And this is all being persecuted by a P5 member of the UN Security Council, Russia, now supported directly also by DPRK, which of course continues to be a security threat in so many other ways. But on this, look no further for proof of the interlinked nature of security in the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. I'm not going to, obviously, this is a China conference, go into the Middle East or Africa or my own conflict countries of Myanmar and Afghanistan, but safe to say there are a lot of challenges that are going on globally. We have a new US administration, in case you hadn't noticed, incoming. Of course, the US is one of our closest partners. We're committed to strengthening the transatlantic bond, positive engagement with the incoming administration, but of course, based on our shared values and shared interests. I would say here that if you think about the US, the EU, and China, we are the 3 leading powers in terms of trade and economics in the world. And whatever happens in one or between two of them invariably has a huge effect on the third. And that is a key part, especially on trade and technology of the environment that we find ourselves in the EU. What are we focused on? Well, the two words, you said it in your intro, Mikko, but competitiveness and security are absolutely key priorities for this new European Commission, and of course the green transition. And when you think of those three things, first of all, they are very much related to each other, and secondly, they are very, very much involving China from the perspective of the European Union. In China itself, you will have more detailed discussions later, but just from the diplomatic point of view, we have to assume that we're seeing a clearly weakened Chinese economy with slower growth, some really systemic challenges to that, a further centralization of power and continuing shrinking space for individuals, and a further developed surveillance state. In terms of foreign policy, we see really a doubling down from China's side on its strategic relationship with Russia. We see it building the different partnership formats aimed at the global south, including BRICS, all of them sort of aimed, I think, quite to marginalize the democratic West. We see them being more assertive in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, with some of their partners and some of their neighbors. I would also say that when we talk about China as a systemic rival, one of the things we mean by that is that there is a competition for the kind of multilateral global system that we want. And I would say, having worked on that for a long time, that advocating for human rights today is much more difficult than I would say it has been for a very long time. Okay, so current dynamics of our relationship with China. Well, 2025 is an important year. It's the 50th anniversary of our diplomatic relations. We, as you saw yesterday, we're looking forward to a summit, presumably at some time in 2025. And just because there was a lot of media reporting to say it has not been scheduled yet. But we, of course, continue with a full range of our dialogues and interactions before then. And one thing that I hope for as well, which I think is key, is an increase of people-to-people exchanges between China and Europe. I myself was sitting in on yesterday's call between the President of the European Council, Costa, and the Chinese President Xi Jinping. And in that call, of course, we underlined, on the one hand, this enduring commitment that we have to dialogue and engagement. We think that's the only way to make progress with China, and stressing the advantages of working together on a lot of, not least, global challenges. But it was a very, very clear message from the President that we also need China to address two crucial challenges that dominate our relationship at this time. Not a surprise to you to hear that it's the unfair, from our point of view, economic imbalances, which undermine European competitiveness, and then China's role as a de facto key enabler of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. So on the imbalances, I think most of your audience will know all the figures, but we've gone from 100 billion to 300 billion deficit in 10 years. Due to a lack of level playing field, subsidies, industrial policies, and so on. And overcapacities are, I would say, a real threat to European Union jobs, European Union innovation, and European Union competitiveness. On Russia, I would say we are not naive about China's strategic intentions. We know that this is a choice to grow this ever closer partnership with Russia. It has to do with their geopolitical direction, to be sort of preeminent, especially with comparison to the US, and it won't be abandoned. We know it's critical to them. But we do insist that, first of all, China, we are their largest trading partner. This is an existential conflict going on our continent. And China is a permanent member of the Security Council that says that it's committed to the UN Charter and international law. And we insist in that context to take seriously our demands on sanctions circumvention, on engaging on a peace process that leads to a just and sustainable peace, and one that's based on the UN Charter, one that doesn't just allow Russia to rearm and come back and contain the sort of guarantees that we need for that. And of course, that the fact is that the estimates point to more than 70% of battlefield relevant technologies coming from or via China. And this is something that I think absolutely has to be addressed unless we want the relationship between the EU and China to deteriorate. I have to tell you that for Europe, when we hear the leader of China say to Vladimir Putin as the parting words that these are changes not seen in 100 years, and we, the two of us, lead them together, this is a source of genuine, I think, legitimate disquiet to Europe, given the behavior of Russia on our continent. And we need China to rebalance this to avoid a further deterioration. And another conversation we, of course, have with China is the DPRK angle, which should worry them because of the consequences also to Northeast Asian security. But I have to say as well that this is complicated for a very, very fundamental reason, and that is that whether on the economic imbalances or on the support for Russia, the origins of these policies are systemic, meaning that they are part and parcel of the strategic direction that China is taking. I mean, honestly feel that on the economic side between EU and China, we should keep saying this to the Chinese. Of course, there can be some kind of win-win, but that would require serious concrete steps by China. Of course, my wish list would be a sort of reform and opening up 2.0 that would create credibility with China's most important economic partners and go back to an understanding that we need each other. Equally, to balance their policy in Europe, they've inserted themselves into our security policy, and we need to have that engagement be in line with international law. But I have to say as well that we don't, I wish I could say we see immediate concrete signs of that. We don't at the moment, perhaps, even though there was a good dialogue yesterday. So for 2025, let's see, hopefully we see signs on this soon. Okay, so finally, the EU approach. How do we act to promote our own interests and values? We live in a geopolitical world, a competitive environment, an increasingly contested world from international law to technologies and the international system. Despite all of our crises that we have to deal with, starting with Ukraine, I do think we have come to the point that we understand that building partnerships in Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific is fundamental to our prosperity, to our security in the future. And that's why you see us building a strong partnership from the new strategic agenda with India to security and defense partnerships with Japan and Korea, and all the other engagements we have to upgrade relations with certain ASEAN countries, and not forgetting, of course, partners like the US, UK, Australia. And that, to do this, I think it involves a push where we have unity in the EU, which is difficult, as you know, of the 27, and it requires that we use all of the instruments. At the end of the day, and I think that not least Ukraine has taught us this, however, despite all the partnerships we build, only Europe can take responsibility for our own security and our prosperity. Nobody else, that's very clear, will do that for us, will look out for us. And that requires that we start always every conversation with what's good for us, what's in our interest, is it in line with our values, and take responsibility for our European security order and the links to the Indo-Pacific as well. That also means we have to do our own analysis. We have to have our own strategic plan. I think that will make us stronger in both Beijing and Washington when we talk to them. On the point of unity, of course, yes, there's always a constant discussion, how strong is this unity? But I would say at the very least, having spent, 2.5 decades, something like that, on and off working on Asia or China, that we at least have come to a point where we understand we have a core foundation of a China policy that I think will withstand pressure and put us in a good place as we meet these new challenges. To briefly outline them, I told you already, engagement and dialogue. Absolutely, that's the way to approach China. Yes, with tough messages sometimes. We need to find cooperation where it's in our interest. And that, of course, includes global issues like climate change. De-risking is a big component where necessary. We know that with a political system like China, there will be limits to what we can do together and limits to how vulnerable and how exposed and dependent we will want to be. China knows that very well as well. Security, we will have to focus more on our own security and therefore also security in all of our foreign relations, including with China. That goes from Ukraine to economic security, from cyber to critical infrastructure, for example, underwater sea cables and other things. And we will work to counter challenges by force or coercion to status quo, standing up for international law. I have to say also it's more difficult perhaps to do that, to stand up for international law in this environment. From the South China Sea to Ukraine, we will do it. We will not apologize for doing that. And we will not apologize for standing up for human rights, from individual cases like Wei Minhai or Ilham Tohti to the situation in Hong Kong or Xinjiang. Although, as you know, that is a very, very difficult environment these days. So the bottom line, I'll leave you with this, that in 2025, we will seek dialogue and engagement with China, cooperation in important areas, but we will stand our ground when it comes to our own European competitiveness and our own European security interests. This is what China does. They will expect us to do the same. They should, although, of course, we will do it our way rather than theirs. And maybe I close with a quote from a former Mongolian foreign minister a long, long time ago. He said, I don't know if it's 100% applicable, but nevertheless, it's a good one. He said, we must respect China, but first we must respect ourselves. So I leave you with that. Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for this comprehensive overview of what you have in store when you think about Europe-China relations in a indeed difficult context. I would like to thank you for making the time and also move on indeed to the next panel, which will give us a chance to discuss those matters in more detail, specifically now starting with the first panel to look at domestic developments. And I would like to hand over to my fantastic colleague, Director of Communications and Publications, Claudia Wessling. Claudia, over to you.
Thank you, Mikko, and also very warm welcome from my side. It's great to be here today and to be hosting this great panel that will deal with the question of which political, economic, and social trends will shape China's trajectory in 2025. I think it's fair to say that last year was a challenging one for China's government. Economic performance was weak. The continuing crisis in the real estate sector, record debt levels of provincial and local governments, and weak public domestic consumption kept Beijing on alert. There were a few measures taken to address these issues, but is all of that enough? Is this enough to keep China's citizens satisfied and the Chinese Communist Party safely at the steering wheel? There are also challenges in the international environment ahead. That was just said in the talks before. Donald Trump will return to the White House. This could bring additional pressure to China's economy if new export controls, for instance, or tariffs were introduced. So what can we expect in 2025 from China? How does China's government deal with the manifold challenges ahead? To discuss this, I am joined by 4 great experts today, and it's my pleasure to introduce them to you. Number 1, Corinne Abele is with us from Shanghai. She's the Shanghai correspondent of Germany Trade and Invest, a German government foreign trade agency, if I explain this correctly. And Corinne has been working in China and Taiwan for almost 2 decades. And right now she's heading the GTAI office in Shanghai, focusing on analyzing China's economic development, industry trends, and her special topics include innovation, digitalization, environmental protection, and other topics that we all should care about. We have Katja Drienhausen here. Katja is the head of our Politics and Society Research Program. Hi, Katja. And her research focuses on the development of China's legal and governance system, as well as human rights in China and state policies towards minorities. Katja has lived in and worked in China for many years, and among others, she has served as a project manager in the Beijing office of the Hans Seidel Foundation. Alicia Garcia-Heredo is with us. She's a senior fellow at Bruegel, the Brussels-based think tank. Alicia is also the chief economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis Bank, and she advises the Spanish government as a member of the Council of Advisors on Economic Affairs. And she's also a close collaborator of MERICS in the framework of the EU Horizons program that is actually funding this event today. Last but not least, Manoj Kewalramani, and I always misspell your name, dear Manoj, please beg for forgiveness. Manoj works for the Takshashila Institution, a leading Indian public policy education center, and his research interests include Chinese politics, foreign policy, and approaches to new technologies. He's a former journalist, and maybe that's why he's writing two quite well-known newsletters. One is called Eye on China, tracking developments in China from an Indian perspective. And the other one, many of you might know it, is Tracking People's Daily, analyzing news coverage and discourse in one of the Communist Party's key mouthpieces. Again, a warm welcome to all of you. Quick technical reminder, we now have around 30 minutes to discuss on our panel. And afterwards, dear audience, there will be 10 minutes for you to discuss with our panelists directly. You can post your questions into the chat here, and then we will select a few for our panelists to answer. Okay, so that clarified. Let me start. Alicia, maybe I can kick it off with you. In the MERICS forecast for 2025, we have asked our participants for assessing the biggest challenges to China's economy. And among the topics mentioned were a looming collapse of the real estate market, heightened government debt levels, weak consumption, and there was more issues that might keep the Chinese government on edge. Export dependency might maybe also become a risk in a fraught geopolitical environment. China just posted a record trade surplus of more than 10% in December. Alicia, you are watching China's economy closely. What is your take, and what are the main challenges for China ahead? And maybe how will the Chinese government tackle these issues? And you're free to pick some examples, because I know this is a very broad field.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss with so many experts. So I'll try to be brief to also learn from the rest. I would say that 2025 is particularly difficult for China for one of the reasons you mentioned, which is that China has been banking on a surplus, on a trade surplus. That has been China's way out for a growth rate that this year will maybe make it to the target. I guess we'll see it, because Xi Jinping told us on his New Year's speech. But, you know, it kind of sounds like a difficult achievement, meaning I don't know how they're going to do it, because if you look at data we got today, I believe, loan data or yesterday, it's actually as underwhelming as ever. Nobody's borrowing in China. So if you think about that and this big trade surplus, you can guess that the expectation is that that growth next year will still be driven by the external sector, and Trump is on the way. This is why I'm saying 2025 will be harder. And you don't need 60% tariffs. We made our calculations. Even much lower tariffs can tilt the balance, especially if the tariffs are extended to countries which China uses as, in a way, to bypass the tariffs, to put it frankly. So where China assembles its own intermediate goods. This is the case of Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico, you name it. The more Trump targets these other kind of vehicles, if you want, for China to export to the US, the harder it will be. If you add to that, you know, a lot of protectionism coming from the rest of the world, emerging economies, also Europe, you know, we had our little tariffs out there, not comparable to the US or even, for that matter, even Turkey, you know, but still relevant, because we are China's market for EVs for as much as 55% of total export. So our little tariffs are also relevant. And this is why I think China will have a hard time next year. Can we hope that there will be a big stimulus supporting consumption? I doubt it. One more news from yesterday, I believe, is that China, there's rumors, it's not officially announced, will cut wages from SOEs, from there was a little bit of an increase in wages for civil servants, but everybody knows that the bonuses would be cut. So the actual effect would be negative. So, you can see the tension. On top of that, and I finish here, Claudia, there's one, and we talk about China's transition to a new growth model. Let me talk about one more transition that is happening in 2025 that will make things pretty difficult. And that is the debt. I call it the debt transition. In other words, China has committed, this is the MPC, I think 8th of November, if I recall correctly, to make shadow debt look official debt. So from local government financial vehicles to actual local government debt. Sounds easy, but it isn't, because local governments will have to now officially be in charge of paying the debt service of this debt at a time where they have no revenue, land sales are really low, actually growing negatively, and they barely make it to pay the salaries of their civil servants. So that's where we are. And therefore, I think something has to come to the forefront, whether it's central government taking this debt, that would make a difference because interest payments would be much lower. Central government giving some kind of new tax to the local government, something has to come. Otherwise, this transition to end here of to make things official, to make debt official, will actually make local governments much more constrained than they already are. And that is very bad news for investment and for consumption.
Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, it seems like you're sharing the kind of pessimistic view that is also reflected in our forecast. And let me turn to our second panelist, Corinne. In our survey and also in the Mentimeter survey we just did, many respondents stated that they expect the Chinese economy to grow by less than 5% in 2025. I don't want you to join the guessing now here, so I'm not expecting you to name a number, but maybe you could describe a little bit from the point of view of someone on the ground in Shanghai, what will be the defining trend in the Chinese economy, and how will foreign companies on the ground be affected if the trend might be a pessimistic one?
To this very interesting panel. I think I just maybe pick up where Alicia already pointed out the main issues actually we are targeting. You said how do they see it and how are they impacted? Maybe just one example. If we come to the property market, for sure, it's down, it will stay down, and that has a huge impact actually on the total economy. What is interesting, if you look at the surveys, so I just quote another survey from the German Chamber, everybody is pretty pessimistic, but still they are looking forward to further deterioration of the economic prospects in this year. But still, there are half of them still want to go on with investment in China. And maybe I'll elaborate a little bit further on this one, because to me, this figure over 50% to people not so familiar with these kind of surveys might still look quite good. But a few years ago, we had figures between 70 and 80%. So it's actually a bad figure. And why are they still reflecting has totally different reasons like years before. First, they came for the cheap production possibilities in China. Then the second round was for the huge market potential and for the huge demand to facilitate it. And now we are basically seeing a lot of investment going on in order not to lose market share, which is already happening in a big circle. And also in order to stay at least kind of competitive to the Chinese competitors. So one of the most arguments why companies are pretty much pessimistic about the prospects in 2025 is actually lagging demand. And this is totally different from the years before. The years before was unfair competition, which is still there. Or not opening up of areas, but now it's actually a lack of demand. This has partly to do with the export development we expect and the foreign trade development we expect in the next year. But German companies are also very much related to the economy in China. So also here demand is lacking. And so I expect for 2025 further price deflation in China, which is going to make the life for German companies, which are partially because of some risk considerations still relying on imports of key technologies from their mother companies and parts, making the life even more difficult because we do have the inflation coming from Europe, and so the imports are getting more expensive, and also their competitiveness will be under very, very high pressure, especially due to the local competitors. What I also wanted to maybe point out is another aspect we see of this competition pressure going on. So the localization is actually part of the kind of de-risking we see from the German companies, because they want to bundle the risks within the Chinese market, so to speak, decouple from imports, decouple also from financing through Europe and their mother companies at home. And also, they are not alone in this boat. I also want to emphasize this. Also, the Chinese competitors basically are, especially the ones which have multinational ambitions, are going to de-risk from China. Alicia also already mentioned it, what is going on in the third markets. And also this has a serious impact on German companies. We see the Chinese competition, the price pressure, the speed, the new business models, not just within China anymore, but also outside of China in areas like the ASEAN, but also further going to Latin America, and also, yes, entering also the European market. And this will speed up competition. I put it like Chinese competition or competition made in China, which has some specifications outside of China, and makes the situation, even more challenging, I would say. Geopolitics, we will talk later. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. So a lot of challenges also for foreign companies on the ground, and the phenomenon that they also localize to China to develop their de-risking strategies, of course, something that also German politics or European politics over here need to look into as we move forward. Katja, to bring you in here, in our surveys, some, I don't know, more than 2/3 of respondents said that these falling real estate prices and economic stress on different levels could make public dissent or protest somewhat likely or very likely. And around 2/3 said maintaining public order would be very important for the CCP in 2025, even more important than tackling the key economic problems that Alicia just listed for us. Would you share this view? Will the CCP continue to really put a hard focus on national security issues? And would you maybe say that this is justified? Is there actually potential for dissent?
Thanks for that provoking question, Claudia. I do think it helps to look at what the party itself is thinking, because it is certainly convinced that maintaining public security deserves special attention in the year forward. This was emphasized in the outcome document of the CCP's top-level meeting last year, the third plenum, but also in a recently published article that was based on key statements by Xi Jinping made over the past few years in summarizing his vision of modernization. And quite currently, provincial-level legislative meetings, such as the one that was happening in Guangdong, are also stressing this point. So I do think that reflects the urgency of the matter. And this should really not come as a surprise, because Xi Jinping himself has repeatedly made the point that economic security, so growth and livelihood issues, many of which we just talked about, that they can threaten social peace and ultimately political security, meaning general support for the party. So in addition to the looming memory of the white paper protests in late 2022, the leadership is particularly spooked by a string of attacks that happened over the past year, many of which were also covered in international media. But I do think it bears mentioning just how widely these were also discussed in Chinese media and online spaces. And in these attacks that were, often called revenge against society attacks, individual, either disgruntled or mentally disturbed citizens actually killed and harmed fellow citizens. And this was perceived as a reflection of the social or socioeconomic stress points within society. Now, in reaction to that, local officials have been called to redouble down efforts to identify risks and contain threats early on, to be preventive about this. But this is also dangerous because it can lead to overreactions that actually cause further pushback. I'm thinking here about the very quick containment, for example, of mass cycling events in Zhengzhou, where young people just got on bikes to travel to another city to savor some soup dumplings, but which became so big with thousands or tens of thousands of participants that this was seen as a potential threat to public security. Or the parties or local governments quite harsh containment of Halloween celebrations in Shanghai last year. And I do think we can certainly expect this very low fun tolerance of the party leadership to continue in the coming year. And to some extent, I think, we can ascertain that there are risks of public dissent in light of the current economic situation, and that the labor market, livelihood issues remain quite an urgent policy area. But was survey respondents have highlighted this existing risk to social stability, to social peace, is something that the Chinese government has built a hugely powerful apparatus for monitoring and containment over the past decade. They have really focused quite a lot of government attention and also resources on being able to contain any open challenges. And I maybe want to end here by also reminding readers that, yes, this is a powerful tool the party has built, but it's also one that is really resource intensive. And it costs money to keep monitoring citizens on the ground, to check up on anyone that may be deemed a potential threat to society based on a list of growing indicators. And that this money is very often better used to actually tackle the underlying sources of many of these causes of discontent, especially considering, as we've heard from Alicia as well, that local government finances are still on quite shaky grounds at best. And I look forward to also hearing my fellow panelists' assessments on these questions.
Thank you, Katja. Manoj, if I may take that up directly, you're reading the Renmin Ribao each day, I guess, and try to read between the lines also. What signs do you take from this reading as to what the Chinese party prepares for in 2025, and what, in your mind, will be the main goals they will put forward to focus on in their political work?
Yeah, thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you so much to MERICS for having me on this really interesting panel. I found the survey also very interesting. I'll be very brief in these initial comments. I think there are just three broad areas that I would touch upon. First is on the economy, and I think everybody's spoken about this already. I think we're going to see more government spending. We're going to see some sort of a stimulus. I don't see it. I agree with Alicia that I don't see the direction of it going towards consumption, or boosting domestic consumption. The Central Economic Work Conference ended in December talking about a moderately loose monetary policy that needs to be pursued. We'll see where the money for this is being allocated, will be allocated come March. I'm not very optimistic that it's going towards domestic consumption. I think what we're going to see is more money being allocated towards existing policy directions, which are focusing on big national projects and trade-in of consumer goods and things like that. So I think that's the one thing that on the economy that I would want to sort of wait and see. And I think the party needs to manage that particular challenge. I won't speak much about that because others have already talked about that. The second point that I wanted to make was politically, I expect that we will see the fourth plenary session being held this year of the 20th Central Committee. Usually the fourth plenums are held 2 years after the Congress, usually in September, October. So I'm anticipating that we will see the fourth plenum this year. That will be a big political event. If you recall the third plenum that was held last year, its resolution had a big emphasis on creating systems and mechanisms, institutional mechanisms. We'll see what the fourth plenum holds. Usually these sessions are around strengthening the party's governance capacity, organizational work, party building, political discipline. A lot of this will fall around the economic challenges, as the third plenary session had indicated. And a lot of that is, of course, linked to Xi Jinping's broader agenda. So it's also political. So I think that would be a big event to watch out for. And I think the party will be looking to, Xi Jinping in particular, will be looking to focus on that. Finally, on foreign affairs, I think the big challenge remains managing the relationship with the United States. There are tremendous uncertainties with what this new administration will bring. It's worth noting that there are challenges that the Trump administration will bring, but there may also be opportunities. The administration seems to have different, it's going in different directions already. You've got one side with Elon Musk, who has deep stakes in China. On the other side, you've got the national security folks, from the new national security advisor to potentially the Secretary of State in Marco Rubio, all of whom are much more hawkish on China, particularly even on issues of human rights. So I think there's a certain risk and challenge balance, a risk and sort of opportunity balance that we're likely to see. I think we're likely to see Beijing continue to be concerned about the economic relationship with the United States, from tariffs to technology restrictions. At the same time, what geopolitical realignments does the Trump administration bring, whether it's with the US, whether it's with European countries, whether it's with countries in East Asia, whether it's with India, and what that does to the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific is something that Beijing will be looking out for. And what Trump does with the war in Ukraine, and what the impact of that on European security is something that Beijing will be seeing opportunities in potentially. And finally, there's an opportunity potentially. Trump has talked about being risk averse when it comes to engaging the US in global conflicts. What does that mean for Taiwan? And does that create opportunities for Beijing to engage in some ways with different aspects of the Taiwanese population and political ecosystem? Perhaps. So I'll leave it at that as my sort of three things to look out for from Beijing's perspective.
Thank you very much, Manoj, also for making the point that the fact that Trump ascends or comes to the White House next Monday does not only bear risks for China. So since there's still a bit of a lack of predictability of what Trump exactly will do, there might also be opportunities arising from that. And those opportunities, as you just pointed to, talking about Taiwan, might for us maybe not be so positive as China sees them. Which is my attempt to transition now into our last question that I would like the four of you to try to answer, looking at what we are supposed to do with this China that is preparing for domestic stress, that has to tackle risks of dissent, which are, as Katja said, well controlled, but still not nil, not inexistent. How should we over here prepare for this China in 2025? And what is maybe the biggest challenge for us as Europeans also looking at this transatlantic situation? And I don't know who wants to kick it off first. Maybe Alicia, I can turn to you.
Thank you. So the easy answer, if one thinks of, a struggling economy of the size of China, would be to try to support China, because nobody wants the largest economy in the world to suffer, which is what we have in front of us for 2025. But the problem is that by doing so, China will continue to bank on its imbalances. I make the problem bigger, to make it very simple. That's why we can't do that. It would be an easy way out, but it is actually only making things worse, because what we really need to do is to put China in a position in which it needs to reform. It needs to change this very imbalanced economic model. So we can only basically, as bad as it may sound, make it harder, not easier. And for that, we can't accept this massive trade surplus. And you may say it's because of our own interest, you can look at it that way, but I think it's actually also in China's interest, because the more China continues with this economic model, the harder that landing will be. And I think this is the only thing we can do. It's not that China is going to decide on its economic future because of us, but if we make it easier, it will just delay the adjustment. So for me, we need to stand, stand there and realize that this is in nobody's benefit, literally, and that China needs to change its economic model as soon as possible before it's too late.
Thank you, Alicia. So clear responses from the European side, maybe even harder political responses. That's what I take away from your input right now. Corinne, would you share that view that we need to bring China to engage in real reforms, to put it bluntly?
Actually, reforms are needed. This is also what I see, actually, what kind of China are we going to see in the next years, in 2025. We wish to see a reform-ready China, but actually we see the opposite of it. I don't expect any reforms also not coming in the next 5-year plan, actually. So it's a kind of go on muddling through, and as also already has been said, it's not really a reform. Also the debt restructure, we just have maybe gained a little bit transparency, but we didn't gain any solution. So what we will see is actually a struggling China, and a struggling China is, and there I also agree, is for us always means for us always more risks and more volatility, and especially for the German companies which are involved, I say it's not just in China but also in the Asian Pacific region. The times will get very, very volatile and risky and intransparent, and the risk to get caught into these different lists, export control, goods, measurements, single case procedures is getting higher and higher and higher. And I hear always from the German companies, especially, that they say, okay, we cannot deal with this, especially when the company size is getting smaller and you are acting in different regions. You cannot keep up with all these different regulations, lists and everything, and you will be responsible for that. So I think giving the companies here some help in order to follow up what they, I think, totally understand, but the means are restricted they can spend, is also a way we should support this, actually. Another point maybe I also want to say is what I see is China is, to my understanding, trying to, I would say, wave a carpet, an economic carpet between China and the ASEAN, especially the ASEAN region. It's like you regionalize your supply chain in little steps. So the interdependency in this region will grow further. And this is also, we have to think about how we can tackle something like this. We should stay relevant in this region. I think this should be also one of our target, and we should be very careful and look very much into it. What is going on here? That the European companies still have a chance to be a part of the ASEAN, for example, region growing, and that we don't leave the area totally to the Chinese companies and their network, which is going to be very aggressive, I think, in the next years. What I also said, because Chinese companies are de-risking from China, and they will be aggressively also looking into this region. One last point I also want to make is we have to have in mind, and we should deal with it, is some of the how to say it. If we look on China, it seems that there are no big reforms of market opening, of fairness and transparency and stuff like that. But there are still reforms going on. For example, the massive approach into dual circulation, establishing a dual circulation system, right? A green tech system combined, and this is combined with digitalization. And there is going to be built up, to my understanding, a new kind of green tech ecosystem, which could also influence future competitiveness, especially for the Europeans, right? Because Europe is also going to go the green path, right, and has very strict decarbonization goals. So also for this, I think we also should not to forget, look very closely what is going on, and maybe taking and learn from that what is going on and being aware, because otherwise we will see some of the things coming out of China and we don't have a clue what has been developed in this country. Thank you.
So a kind of decoupling in an area where some still say that there is also potential for collaboration, the green tech realm, so to say. I do not want to run over time here. So Katja, just very briefly, what to your mind is the biggest challenge and how should we prepare for it?
And maybe also start with the silver lining and say that, indeed, we do see some reforms, some positive measures from economic stimulus, incentives for consumption, social policy reforms that are underway. And especially we at MERICS will be watching these areas at the upcoming National People's Congress in March to kind of keep an eye out for the positive side of things. But overall, I have to agree with Alicia and Corinne in the sense that international observers should not expect a less than ideal economic situation at home to make Beijing more amenable to compromise or engaging internationally, especially with Western counterparts. Quite the opposite if we look at quotes from Xi Jinping recently kind of edited and published in the leading kind of party magazine, Qiu Shi. That does give an informative view into the mindset. To quote directly, he said that history has repeatedly proved that if we seek security through struggle, we will survive. If we seek security through weakness and concession, we will perish. And I do think if you read that together with, for example, his recent statements in the meeting with Biden in Beirut late last year, where he defined China's development interest as a red line, that does reflect what kind of mindset and willingness to escalate where necessary in the defense of China's interests the current leadership is going into this year.
Thanks, Katja. Manoj, maybe I can ask you directly, is this China reaching out to the Asian region and evolving as a competitor on certain markets? Is that the focus point of where Europe should look into?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of reaching out to Asian regions, yes, I think that there are different things that Europe and the rest of the world can do. Like-minded partners can do to try and deal with China. I mean, to me, quickly, I think that 2025 we'll see. I call it the 3 strengths and 1 weakness in very typical people's daily fashion. I think we'll see a confident China that believes that the economic and political power distribution is much more balanced. It'll work to narrow the military power gap with the US. I think we'd like to see an assertive China, though not wolf warriorism, particularly assertive when it comes to its core interests and seeking to exploit any tensions that Beijing sees may emerge between the US and its allies and partners in the Trump era. We'll see a China that will reach out to the global south, like your survey said, but we'll see a China which is judicious in its external economic engagement, given its economic challenges at home. That gets me to my weakness, which is that we'll see a somewhat anxious and circumspect China, which is trying to balance between the strategic goal of shifting its economic development model while making the tactical adjustments to try and sustain what are immediate problems of unemployment, debt, consumption. The challenge always in these situations is when do tactical adjustments have a strategic impact? And I think that's the balance that Xi Jinping and his economic planners need to meet. What do we need to do? I think we need to invest in domestic capacity and strength. Europe, India, other countries need to invest in domestic capacity because it's only through your strength can you engage with China to achieve meaningful outcomes. We need to work together on common issues of economic trade, technology, particularly we need to think of not self-reliance, but common resilience when it comes to China. So that means that Europe, India, Asian countries need to work much more together to deal with China's overcapacity problem by developing our own capacity. And finally, we need to work together on reforming global governance, in particular for the developed world. I think it is important to keep in mind that as long as institutions of global governance are not representative of the changing realities of the world, particularly around the global south, you will cede the space to China. And I think that's where India and Europe and the US and others can work together.
Thank you, Manoj. Clear call for more collaboration between Indo-Pacific or India and European countries. We still have a few minutes left to tackle a few questions that are thrown at us here in the chat. There's one very brief question at the beginning, Alicia, and maybe you can say something about it. Whether or not we have a too optimistic understanding of China's economy due to the fact that some of the statistics might be falsified and incorrect. And we've all read about this economist who recently disappeared because he spoke of 2% growth or even less. How do you see that? Is it even worse?
Well, frankly, I don't think it's so important to judge whether growth is 2, 3, or 4 at this juncture. It's certainly not as bad that we would have people on the street, or or at least not enough people on the street. What I'm trying to say here is that I think the situation for me is growth-wise stagnant, supported by exports, but in a way, even if growth is slower, it is not bad enough to really change that call for a plummeting economy. I'm just trying to say that I don't think that's where we are. I think where we are is in an economy which struggles to change an economic model that was based on basically real estate and exports. It remains based on exports, and they just can't find their way out. The way out, we all know it, is consumption, some kind of welfare state, you name it. And that's ideologically, in my view, I wouldn't say unfeasible, but unwarranted. China just doesn't want that. So how bad it can become, it's too early to say, but I don't think that picture of, everything is wrong in China and we don't know anything of what's going on is so much, or is conducive to a good judgment. I think what we have already is problematic enough with the numbers we have. They may be overstated, but not to the point of changing the picture, which is already pretty gloom, sorry. So I would just leave it there. I don't think it's a good, it doesn't help basically, conversation. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Thanks. Completely different question, but Manoj, since you also mentioned Trump and the changes, the political changes in the US, there is a question that, according to an article in the Washington Post, the CCP does not know yet how to react to Trump. Do you think that is true?
The honest answer would be, it's very difficult to say, because you have very little access to the system. But my sense is that there is obviously a certain amount of consternation around what a Trump administration would bring. Like I said, because of the fact that you have these different sort of divisions ideologically and politically within the Republican administration. I talked about Musk and the security hawks on the other side, but there's also a Congress which is there's a bipartisan consensus around being tough with China. Trump's policies himself, he's talked about with other countries, like Alicia initially mentioned, that partly the aim is also to potentially target countries where third countries where China, Chinese companies export from. So I think there is a certain, like I said, there's an opportunity and there is potential for deal making that can happen. But there's also anxiety around what that could eventually result in and what a Trump administration could result in. To me, there is this sort of balance between opportunities and risks. On the economic side, on the technology side, the risks remain extremely high. On the security and geopolitical side, I'm not necessarily as sure. The last Trump administration was tough on China, even from a security perspective. The idea of the Indo-Pacific became American policy under the last Trump administration. The last Trump administration supplied weapons to Taiwan. The last Trump administration deepened the relationship with India, looking at it as a bulwark against China. So I think if you look at path dependence and track record, you anticipate a tough time ahead for China on all fronts. But if you look at the current political economy of the US, if you look at Trump's own admissions that he doesn't want to be engaged in foreign conflicts, and he wants to resolve the conflict in Ukraine in whichever way possible, those are opportunities for China. So I think we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. And I think that's what also Beijing is looking at.
Thank you, Manoj. I'll take one last question and then I would wrap it up here to be almost on time. And the question goes to Corinne. Do you expect any major changes in Germany's China strategy on trade after the election that is coming on February 23rd in Germany? And what are German businesses doing to prepare for the EU-Trump-China nexus ahead? It is phrased here. And I don't know if you can really talk about it, but maybe you can give us a few hints.
Actually, this is also a very tough question. But yeah, it gives all the companies, especially what we are also dealing with, the small, medium companies, a big headache. As I already mentioned, because the risk and the fear of getting caught between these geopolitical conflict, which with the new modern tools of export controls, of tariffs, of list policies, of blocking of sanctions. Also, this is in the thing is the fear is very big. So how to prepare? I already mentioned that if you look into very export-oriented small, medium enterprises, they need a transparency. Just to follow what's going on in the different fields is a challenge for some of the companies. And they need to prepare, and they might also need some help in preparing for this situation. And also, I just can say that for them it's the same. It's a very unstable situation. But do I expect the trade trend, which is declining? I mean, the exports to China from Germany, from the EU decline. Germany massive, from the EU still decent decline. Will that change? I don't expect that. Giving the trends we see, giving the trends of self-sufficiency, seeing 2025 as the last year of Made in China, 2025, the big program, I don't see that this will be a turnaround. And also with inflation versus deflation trends, I don't see it.
Thank you very much, Corinne. And yes, thank you to all my panelists here. So a few takeaways that I have memorized here. Something has to come, Alicia Garcia Heredo said, to tackle the problems of China's economy, and we will all see what the CCP comes up with. Katja Drienhausen said that national security will be a priority, but it's expensive. Manoj Kewal-Ramani pointed to the fact that China is more and more focused on third markets and on the Asia-Pacific region, and that more collaboration might be needed between Europe and the countries in the region to deal with this issue. And Corinne Abele says and pointed to the issues that foreign companies and German businesses have on the ground and the difficulties they are facing in preparing for this new era where Donald Trump will change politics in the White House. Thank you all for being here today, and I hope you stay on for the second panel and also for the introduction to our forecast surveys that my dear colleague Andreas Mischer will now embark on. Andreas is an analyst in our research team for economics, for China's economy, and he and our colleague Klaus Sung have invested a tremendous amount of work in putting this forecast together, evaluating the results, the answers of more than 800 China watchers from different backgrounds. And I'm not going to talk anymore now. Andreas, handing the floor over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, Claudia. I would say that today's live survey and our first panel have already indicated that China's situation is being perceived as rather difficult. And this fits the broad picture that has also emerged from our 2025 MERICS China Forecast survey. It's been the 6th time that MERICS has asked the China expert community, and between November and December last year, 843 participants filled out our detailed survey. So because of that, we would like to thank you very much for your time, because being able to tap into the crowd wisdom is obviously very helpful for our work, and we hope that it is helpful for yours too. So now I would like to give you a quick overview over our key insights, and you will also find all the slides and much more details on our website. So the overall picture that has emerged from the survey is that participants expect a difficult year for China, both domestically and in foreign relations. Participants also expect strong headwinds for the Chinese economy, with growth presumed to stay below 5%. They also expect growing social stress across the Chinese society, and externally, they expect continued support for Russia in its war against Ukraine, continued rivalry with the US, and also deteriorating relations with the European Union. So now let's take a look at some of the key questions of our survey. So first one is China's domestic situation in 2025. We asked people, in your view, which of the following are significant risks for China's growth outlook in 2025? And despite the Chinese government's efforts to boost the economy in 2024, our participants regard risks for the Chinese economy to be grave. 73% of respondents said that weak consumer demand posed significant or very significant risks to the economy. Real estate market problems and excessive government debt levels are also perceived as important risks. Next, we asked what domestic issues would be most important for the Chinese Communist Party leadership in 2025. And 84% of our respondents felt that upholding public order and preventing protests would be the most important issue for the Chinese government, followed by strengthening patriotic campaigns and ideological control. On the other hand, only 19% of respondents think that reducing income inequality will be a priority, which I think again highlights the strong focus on order and control even more. And as our next question shows, this will probably not help with reducing stress in the Chinese society. Asked what pressure points are likely to see public dissent and or protests in China in 2025, participants' answers mainly point towards economic conditions. 76%, so more than 3/4 of experts believe that economic stress, such as related to real estate, bankruptcy, as well as to unemployment, labor conditions, and wage disputes, are likely to trigger dissent or protests in 2025. On the other hand, other issues such as women and LGBTQ rights or corruption are not seen as likely causes. Moving to a different topic now, we also asked a number of questions on China's innovation and tech development. I would like to pick just one question here that I think is of particular interest. And for that, we asked about risks for China's research and development progress in 2025. And although 62% of our China watchers expect China's innovation capabilities to improve in 2025, they indeed see several problems for China's research and development progress as well. For instance, 60% believe that decreasing access to Western technology will be an important risk to China's R&D progress. Another large risk is decreasing international science cooperation. And in contrast, only 10%, only 1/10 of our respondents think that a lack of funding will be an issue for China here. Now shifting topic again, we have 4 more slides showing our respondents' views on the development of China's foreign engagement and its international relations in 2025. First, we asked how China's relationship with Russia will develop in 2025 in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine. And for this question, I can tell you that participants are convinced that China's relationship with Russia will not sour. A majority of respondents thinks that China would either continue its current level of support, so the status quo from 2024 basically, or even increase its support for Russia economically and politically. However, most respondents don't expect China to start delivering lethal military equipment to Russia. And only 4% think that China will decrease its support. We also asked about expectations regarding EU-China relations in 2025. And most respondents are gloomy about the future of those relations. 56% of our respondents think political relations between the EU and China will deteriorate in 2025, while only 18%, so less than 1/5 of participants, think they will improve. Now, answers are more mixed for economic relations and people-to-people relations, but in both cases, more respondents believe that relations will deteriorate than there are people who think they will improve. Then a glimmer of hope from another question is that 63% of participants think that China and the EU will at least make progress in cooperation on environmental policy and climate change in 2025. The perception is similarly worried when it comes to China-US relations under the Trump administration. Respondents overwhelmingly expect relations to deteriorate. Not a surprise, I think, because 94% expect more tech export controls, followed by 88% who think that there will be a new trade war, and 80% who expect an acceleration of economic decoupling. Only 7% expect an improvement in bilateral relations for 2025. And finally, when it comes to transatlantic cooperation on China under the Trump administration, we asked what the EU and its member states should prioritize in their transatlantic agenda on China. And very clearly, participants do not want the EU to pick a side between China and the US. 2/3 of our participants think that the EU should diversify its partnerships globally or to try to balance between the US and China. Only small shares of respondents believe that the EU should align either more with the US or rebuild trust with China. Now, what this could mean in practice is something for our next panel to discuss, I think. And again, you will find the full survey on our MERICS website. But for now, I hand back to Claudia to introduce our next session. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Andreas. And yes, there are challenges ahead in international relations to China, and that is exactly with a particular focus on Europe, what our next panel will deal with, what's ahead for European China policy in light of changing transatlantic dynamics. That's the title we chose for our panel, which will be moderated by Jordan Dahl. Jordan, hi, good to see you. And I hope they will pull you up on the screen right now. Jordan is a reporter for Politico in Brussels. As a journalist, she focuses on mobility and the automotive sector. She previously did spend 5 years in Beijing, China, working as a tech reporter and in the foreign policy space at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So who would be better suited for moderating this next panel than you, dear Jordan? I'm handing it over to you to introduce us to your panelists.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for having me. It should be fun. Well, we just heard a lot about all of the economic struggles that is happening domestically in China. That does not bode good news for Europe, which is already facing its own economic malaise, tensions with China over trade and the dumping of Chinese EVs, and an absent Germany as it faces a snap election next month, all while Trump takes office in 5 days. So we have a lot to get into, so let's introduce our panelists. We have Elena Suarez Sanchez. She is Senior Advisor for Business Europe. Julia Friedlander, CEO of Atlantic Brücke, and Matt Turpin, Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Thank you all for joining. So to kick things off, if you could give a couple of sentences of where you see the biggest potential points of conflict in the EU-China relation. And Matt, let's start with you.
Sure. So biggest points of contention in the EU-China relationship.
Yes.
Well, I think we obviously would start with Putin's ongoing war in Ukraine and obviously the material support that Beijing continues to provide, whether that's the components and materials that allow the war machine to continue to run, which I think we've seen and well documented over time. A Russian defense industrial base really is only able to operate given the massive support that Beijing has been providing. And obviously we've seen the cutting of cables, we've seen a variety of actions, and so I think that's going to continue to sit and motivate. But that geopolitical area could have been mitigated had there been really a convergence on economic interests over the last 4 years between Beijing and Brussels. And I think what we've seen is the opposite happen. And obviously the last panel did, I think, an excellent job of explaining the internal dynamics inside the Chinese economy and everything that's going on. But this lack of ability to conduct economic reforms, the things that sort of everyone can obviously see that Beijing needs to do, which is to boost its own domestic consumption, which politically means that the party needs to give up the reins of the full control of the economy and turn it over to the Chinese people, that the inability to conduct those reforms is creating beggar thy neighbor policies around the world and placing everybody else's economy at risk. And so as that unfolds, that takes away what had been a large ballast in the relationship, and making it very contentious. So this sort of geopolitical, pure, clear national security risk, as well as the economics of it, I suspect does not bode well to a Brussels-Beijing relationship.
Sounds a bit like a perfect storm. And I want to come back to you on Ukraine because there's a lot to talk about that. Elena, I want to go to you from the trade perspective. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what you see coming between the EU and China on trade now that Trump will be back in the office? Oh, I think we have you on mute. Can you try again? I see you're unmuted. No, we still can't hear you. All right, well, you get that sorted. Julia, let's move to you. You're an economic financial expert. You actually had a paper come out the other week arguing that Trump might be a silver lining for Europe. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Because I think that, and I say this sort of from European regulatory, but also from a German economic perspective, that riding off of several, essentially 12 years of expansionary markets and mostly positive story with regards to economic relations with China, that the external factors, and I think Matt and the previous panel outlined sort of on the China side what those external factors are, but also that there's sort of, you're going to have an additional push from across the Atlantic is actually going to incentivize Europe and moreover Germany in the competitiveness sense to undergo reforms that they were sort of able to push aside and say this wasn't necessary yet. Right. And so that has to do with capital markets reform, with energy pricing, and with certain industrial policies where, to be frank, for the longest time, and, you were able to garner gross national income from overseas markets and especially from China and use that income to subsidize production and employment at home. And so Germany is confronting a bit of an industrial crisis, somewhat a little bit sort of delayed by the 12 years of success in overseas sales. So in some ways, they're coming to terms with some of the deindustrialization that has driven some of the anti-China or anti-market curve in the United States with with its effect on industrial policy and domestic employment. So that's where I mean, again, like I don't see this as, you know, I'm not going to be Pollyannish and underestimate the risks of what and sort of just schizophrenia I think we might have experienced under the second Trump administration with regards to who wants to do what and how they're going to counteract and conflict with each other, various advisors. But I think sometimes the silver lining is holding your feet to the fire.
History is any indication, it could change by the minute or, you know, by the day with Trump. Elena, I see that you are back with a different camera. Do we have you back?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. There we go.
Sorry for that. I now joined from my computer because yeah, it was not working. So Jordan, can you maybe repeat your question? And thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. We were just talking about the trade aspect of the EU-China relationship and what may be happening under Trump. In your mind, do you feel that Trump coming back into the office is going to be pushing the EU and China back together, or are we going to continue seeing the Commission taking a harder stance on China with anti-subsidy investigations, duties, and really looking at the overcapacity that Europe or that China is dumping into the European Union?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Jordan. So, well, in terms of our cooperation with the US and the new Trump administration coming in, you know, I think from our side, I think that the US will continue to be one of our major allies. No doubt about that. We face common challenges when it comes to the China issue, and in the previous panel and previous colleagues mentioned, you know, already the huge issue that we have with the market distortions created by China and the overcapacity is a concern that we share with the US. So no doubt that we will, you know, continue to cooperate with the US on this. But it's true that the previous administration and most likely the next one will have a different approach when it comes to confronting China on these issues. The US certainly has had a much more confrontational approach that we have. So from our side, we call on a stronger cooperation between the EU and the US to address these issues, but really based on an equal partnership. So where, you know, each other's distinct political and economic interests are respected, but where we cooperate really on an equal footing. Areas of cooperation that are important for European companies are, for example, on export controls. You know, the US measures are extraterritorial, and our companies operate, you know, in Europe, in the US, but also in China. So these measures really have an effect on them. Another area where we need to cooperate and extend that cooperation to other allies, and notably in the G7, is about industrial subsidies. But it's also about, you know, economic security, continue to working closely with the US, but also reaching out to other allies, particularly in the G7, which also have a lot of experience on dealing with economic security issues. This is Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others. But having said that, I mean, as we all know, Trump is highly volatile, highly unpredictable. So this is, of course, extremely challenging for our companies to navigate. So we are at the moment, I would say, operating under a lot of uncertainty on what he will do. He has said that he will impose 60% duties on Chinese imports to the US. That remains to be seen if he will really go that way. That will have an influence in, for example, inflation in the US, etc. So let's see if he really follows through on that. And of course, coming back to your question, this will also have an impact, may have an impact for the EU, because some of those exports may be redirected to the EU, you know, creating much more distortions in the EU, and this will prompt reactions European from the institutions, because we cannot absorb all these imports that we are getting from China.
Many thanks. Julia, I want to go back to you. So just the last couple of days, we've seen a lot of action in the EU. On the one hand, you had the European Council President Costa meeting with, or having a phone call rather, with Chinese President Xi Jinping, taking a pretty soft approach, while the Commission is taking some other actions, more anti-China policies of limiting outbound investment, the IPI, just a week before Trump comes in. What do you make of that? How should we be reading these actions by the Commission just a week before Trump takes office?
To be honest, I think it has less to do with Trump taking office than the fact that you have a new commission that's getting its gears rolling. You have, if you look at, I think it's five commissioners that have some jurisdiction over competitiveness or industrial policy or economic growth. This is clearly a one of the foundational aspects of this commission and the kind of constellation of individuals that Ursula von der Leyen has collected around her. And so I don't, again, I think it's if anything, it's a show that, it's a sign that the regulatory show will go on according to the strategy that the Commission has outlined over the past several years. Than it is, I think, any sort of particular tee up to the Trump administration to say, look, we're being tough, so don't be tough on us. Maybe I'm being, again, like, I'm not in the room or anything. I think generally with the European Council, it's tough to speak for all member states. Again, like, the Commission is a technical arm, and again, like, the chair of the European Council is not doesn't have a sort of statutory role as the Commission would be, in terms of leaning farther out the window. So I would, again, I would be cautious in overinterpreting that as a sign that that Europe is rudderless, or a headline we might read in the Wall Street Journal.
Sure. But speaking of rudderless, Matt, you actually wrote about the German government being rudderless and how now is really not an opportune time for that. What do you think the risks are of having another month to go until you have the German elections, and then presumably another couple of months until you get an actual coalition and a functional government back together? What are the risks of what can happen in the interim?
Yeah, well, I'd start with, obviously, Berlin is not the only one. We have a pretty difficult situation in Tokyo, continuing to be difficult. Obviously, even a worse situation in Seoul. You've got a transition happening in Ottawa. And so you've got a number of places, and obviously Paris is in the same boat. So you've got a number of places that are going through this. And I think that it creates, so the risks that this creates is, sort of an inability that, as we are 5 days away from a new executive coming in to the White House, that there really isn't anyone in a number of these capitals that is able to have sort of an early talk with the Trump administration as it puts together its plan of what it wants to do, right? Obviously, some of that has been going on over the last 2 months, but you're gonna get the actual people in their jobs and in their positions, and they're going to start putting together things, and that means they're likely not going to be taking into account what these critical partners have to say and think about these things, because they lack sort of clear leaders that have the authority and mandate to be able to sort of execute things. And I think that's going to be really problematic. So it's really unfortunate.
You raised a good point about different governments kind of all over, really seeing a lot of turmoil. You mentioned Ottawa, Japan. Elena, I want to go back to you about the trade aspect of that. You're seeing more right-wing governments being put into place, more right-wing candidates gaining ground. What does that mean in terms of overall trade policy, and how might that impact China and its ability to export to other markets?
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Of course, I mean, well, couple of things. First of all, what I would say is that, and this is reflected in a China dedicated paper that we published in November, is that one of the things we need on the way forward with our relations with China is unison in the way we act in the EU. And we saw that, for example, in the case of EVs, where, certain member states change their position on the votes, on the duties, because, of course, Beijing plays very well divide and rule. They know to which member states to reach out to and pressure them into, changing certain policies because they are offered certain, let's be very honest, certain investments in certain areas, etc. So what we say from our point of view is that really we need to act much more in unison in the EU. Internal differences between member states should be sorted at EU level and really come to China with a unified position and approach. This is the only way that the EU can really leverage our economic, importance and stance and our internal market vis-a-vis China. Because if we act, just having in mind the interest of individual member states, we are not gonna get very far. And of course, China knows very well to which member states to go to, depending on what they are looking for. So really, our plea is for unity in the European Union, a much more coherence and coordinated approach, and of this we can go on if you want on beefing up much more research on China, dialogues between member states together with businesses and other stakeholders on China, and things like that to really define our long-term strategy.
Julia, is that call for unity likely to be heeded?
Yes and no. I think that there are limitations to what you can expect individual member states to react to depending upon their individual vulnerabilities. And this is sort of again, this is when I said this in the article that you referenced as well, and this has to do with sort of the relationship to Washington, and this is something that I experienced, and sort of full disclosure, Matt and I both served in the National Security Council at the same time, so we're close colleagues, is that many European governments would come to Washington to sort of register their talking points and their position, expecting that they could sort of project through US power to create a policy position in Brussels. And let's just say I think that the aptitude, the receptivity for that kind of behavior is very narrow, and is getting narrow, and was narrow last time and is even narrower this time. Was narrow under the Biden administration too. Again, this is sort of an easy way out through Washington. And so I think that sometimes by making that sort of push a little bit, I think that member states will come more to the centrality of Brussels as the way to push their agenda. But again, like we saw this in the debate over what Alicia referred to as the mini tariffs, maybe not mini tariffs on electric vehicles, is that ultimately, there are majorities within Europe for a stronger position vis-a-vis China. And I think that again, it's China's external behavior. Perhaps it is also the relative weakening of the Chinese economy that is a perception that there's less leverage that the Chinese can hold over the EU, that then allows countries that were sort of waiting in the wings to be able to exert themselves a little bit more.
Are you expecting, or should we expect the Commission to take further action on EVs? Because as you guys have said, the duties are so low, the profit margins are high enough that they can eat that cost and still enter the EU. The US is blocked to them. Trump tariffs presumably will make other markets more difficult. So what can the Commission do, or what should the Commission do in response to that?
I mean, I think that there is a if electric vehicles are going to be your breaking point, and I think that, within the German debates, sometimes I ask them, like, what do you actually want out of this? Do you want like domestic production to stay? Do you want the presence of, nominally German companies? Of course, these are all multinational listed companies. They're not only German, they're owned by everyone. And what is the actual goal? And I think that, to be honest, it's about whether there are competitive models of electric vehicles that emerge within the European market that can come closer to a Chinese price point, and that will direct whether there's pressure on the Commission to raise the tariffs or not. And you see that happening. I say this because I'm a case in point. I'm a Tesla driver. I'm a Tesla driver not because I like Elon Musk. I'm a Tesla driver because I wanted to drive electric, and that was the only model that fit into the government incentives that the German government that placed for purchase of electric vehicles. So the national level incentives that they put in place to purchase electric vehicles did not match the market of their own of Volkswagen and Mercedes and et cetera. So again, it's a long way of saying I think that we're on a road to an increased tariff schedule vis-a-vis China, but based on a wait and see approach as to how the European models develop in the coming year.
Great anecdote. Matt, when it comes to Ukraine and this issue of unity, there doesn't seem to be a lot of cohesion about how to approach Ukraine, how much funding it should get, what weapons to be sent. Do you think that will, I hesitate to use the word resolve, but be more unified with Trump sort of taking a back step from the US in terms of Ukraine? And what does that mean for China's role in that conflict?
Yeah, so I suspect that the Trump administration will come in and put real pressure to bring the conflict to an end. And I think it's generally in all of our interest to not have a massive war happening with lots of deaths on either side. And so I think there is going to be pressure to bring that to an end, and that there will need to be carrots and sticks being offered to both sides. And so I suspect that Beijing will cement the relationship between Beijing and Moscow. I don't think it will break it. I think we should have no illusions that we're going to see some sort of Sino-Russian split anytime soon. And of course, Moscow and Beijing will try and portray this as a victory, that they've gotten Ukraine to back down. But of course, we can all remember that this isn't actually a victory. I mean, Putin is unlikely to achieve the objective that he originally laid out. And so, it has a lot to do with how we interpret how this came out. But I suspect that what we're going to see is that Beijing and Moscow both believe that the use of force is an appropriate and available option for them to be able to change the international system in their favor. And I think that's a really dangerous and really concerning situation. So I don't know how we necessarily fix that at this point, because that's I think the lessons they've learned.
And China, of course, for its part, would love to get credit for some kind of a peace deal, bringing an end to it. Of course, they, as you've pointed out, are helping to supply the war and really backing up Russia in its conflict. With this sort of resolution that you're outlining, could China get that credit that it is desiring, or is the international community seeing through it?
I suspect that it will try very hard to push that perspective in Europe. And I suspect it will receive There will be portions of various European constituencies that will receive that positively. I think that's a huge problem. But it sort of goes back to what I judge as a deep unwillingness to really look at what Beijing has been doing to help Russia in this war, and sort of creating sort of these unnatural. Well, they're not providing soldiers or lethal arms. Well, no, actually, what they're doing is they're providing all the components to make all those lethal arms. But we've defined ourselves that, well, so they're holding back. They're not doing everything. And I think that suggests that we are unwilling to really recognize what's going on, and which suggests that that narrative will play well across certain communities. And of course, the United States under the next administration is going to do a number of things that will further the belief that Europe really shouldn't put itself in the U.S. camp. It really needs to straddle China and the United States, and that will further fracture all of those things.
Is that going to have any repercussions on Taiwan over the next 4 years?
I mean, it certainly could. I mean, obviously, I think Beijing makes its own decisions about Taiwan based upon its own judgment of whether or not it could succeed militarily. It would prefer to continue to use political warfare, economic coercion, and military threats to erode the capacity of the Taiwanese people to maintain their de facto independence. But that's their preferred approach. But I suspect that Beijing is continuing to make judgments about its ability to use military force to achieve its ends. And I think the war in Ukraine has provided important lessons to Xi Jinping that may convince him that the use of military force is a viable option.
I want to turn to some of the questions that are being posted in the chat from viewers, and please do keep posting in. We can take a couple more. Elena, I want to turn to you for the first one, and this person asks, what do panelists make of the opinion expressed by many participants in the poll that Europe should balance between the US and China? What could this quote-unquote balancing actually mean?
Yeah, that's not an easy question, because it's true that that we are in between the two, and that's not easy, because it's true that while we need to continue to the risk from China, and this we have said clearly, China will continue to be a very important market for our companies, is a very important market for our companies, and will continue to be in the near future. So what I would say is that when it comes to China, and then when it comes to the US, so when it comes to China, we need to continue to de-risk, and this should focus on building resilience through diversification, and this is about the trade agreements that we need to get through the line. It's about implementing quickly our Critical Raw Materials Act, because we have a huge dependency, especially on raw materials. It's to improve the resilience of our own economy, working on our competitiveness. On this, I don't need to say much, because I think it's clear, and it has been really outlined in the Letta and Draghi reports. It's about continuing to use the tools that we have at our disposal, and that the Commission has beefed up in recent years. It's about the foreign subsidy regulation. It's about IPI, to name a few, plus the traditional trade defense instruments that we have. Will these tools be enough? That remains to be seen. It's about acting in unison. I already spoke about that. But of course, we will have to continue to engage with China on many issues. Is the second world's economy. It's our second trading partner. So second trading partner in goods. So we will have to continue to engage with China and also to solve global challenges. And this has been mentioned already in the previous panel, to tackle climate change, future pandemics, etc. And so that's about China. When it comes to the US, I mean, I don't think, well, it's a huge, we are now saying this under huge uncertainty on what Trump will really do. But from our side, we think that no matter who is in the White House, it will continue to be one of our major allies or main ally. And as far as we can, we should try to continue to strengthen our cooperation with the US as much as possible, provided that this is really on an equal footing and that our interests are also respected. This is not about the US dictating the policy and we just following, but it's really about an equal partnership where we can discuss and take action, coordinated action as much as possible. So that will really, it really remains to be seen how the future administration will really behave. So I think that at the moment there is a lot of uncertainty and volatility to be expected.
A good segue into our next question. Julia, I want to turn to you. Who is going to be posing tougher challenges for European governments in the next 40 years? The US or China? And in what respect?
Excuse me. I think that sort of the longer competitiveness challenge and sort of strategic challenge will remain China. And that's because of the consistency of their actions and the explicit attempt to outpace. Again, I'm just looking from the competitiveness side here. The security side is unquestionably a greater Chinese challenge. But on the competitiveness side, the explicit attempt to outcompete Europe in key industries. What the danger from the Trump administration side is, of course, that you have strategies that range from A to Z. That will and then you will have a sort of conflict between, and the previous panel touched on this as well, between hard national security hardliners and the competitive industrialists, and then the free marketeers. So you have the sort of three, between the nominations for the Treasury Secretary to some of the advisors. I mean, to sort of to include the Commerce Department, but then Marco Rubio on the hardliner side, you're going to have this sort of triangulation of, well, we don't really know who's going to gain sort of the upper hand on the decision making and when it hits the road. So it'll be sort of my assessment is sort of a bit of and not that the Biden administration didn't cause regulatory headaches, and we just saw it with the chip action just a few days ago, but it's sort of a network of different China policies and initiatives that it's going to be hard for the Europeans to necessarily follow and see which one's going to win at any given time. That's going to be the same for U.S. markets. That's going to be the same for U.S. policies. That's going to be the same for you and I. So I don't think anyone, like the EU, is exceptionally disadvantaged in that point. But I think through that sort of variations in opinion, the EU actually has quite a bit of leverage to seek out the ones where they think, okay, this is the line of thinking that we appreciate. Let's try to put our wind behind those sails. So I think that there's a little bit of opportunity there as well. So heavily on the China side, appreciating that there will be a lot of loud noise from Washington.
Matt, we have a military question that I'm quite eager to see how you're going to answer. Will the US under Trump give up the one China policy and recognize Taiwan as an independent country? And should the EU follow that approach?
Yeah, to answer it simply, I don't think so. I don't think we'll see a change over the next 4 years in that in that sort of foundational policy, barring Beijing's use of force, right? Barring a conflict, I don't think we would see that change. In a conflict, I think all bets are off, right? I mean, in a conflict, it would suggest that the bargain that the United States has with Beijing about that policy would be totally up for grabs if Beijing were to use military force to try and annex Taiwan. I'd like to return to just a quick point, and I think it's important to understand what I think is sort of the macro approach that the United States is sort of thinking about here. And I think while I agree with Julia completely that there are going to be various factions that are sort of competing for influence and trying to figure out, and we can already see this going on even before they've taken office. But I think it's important. I think my judgment of what President-elect Trump is trying to do is fundamentally to renegotiate how the global economic and trade system works in the world in ways that are more beneficial to the United States. I think that's sort of the meta level of what's going on, and there will be a strong demand signal across all the departments and agencies to get behind that effort. And so, to me, it was the theme of the first administration, but you didn't really have the people in place who understood that. And I think as I've watched the sort of the picking of folks and the folks that are going to come in, that is the underlying theme. So, I think for Brussels and for European countries, if the response is a sort of a knee-jerk, everything has to be done through the WTO, I think Washington will view that as an unserious response. Like that's just not how the world even works now. So why would we continue to stick to something that is just not functioning anymore?
Trump does seem to be far better prepared this go around in terms of really hitting the ground running and getting his people in place. We are running up on time, so Elena, I want to go to you for the last question. China is telling its financial system to develop overseas, go forth. What challenges will that produce for the EU?
Yeah, I don't know if I understood the question correctly, because I was reading it on the chat. If this means, that the Chinese are really trying to increase the importance of the yuan in order to be a kind of parallel currency to the dollar. If the question goes in that direction, I think it will be extremely challenging for China to do that. Even in the BRICS, they have tried to really promote the yuan as or even other currencies as alternatives, etc. And other countries like, for example, India is ready to for example, stop that. So I don't think that they will really succeed on that. And the dollar will continue to be, the currency that will continue to, dominate in the near future the global financial system, I would say.
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining, our panelists for taking the time. Really interesting discussion. I wish we could have more time to dive deeper into it. But for now, I'll turn you back over to Mikko Huotari for our closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for an excellent panel and moderation, and also for the cooperation with Politico. Let me wrap up those intense 2 hours of expert conversation about what we can expect to be a year of quite non-linear developments that require not just mental preparedness, but good analysis, also quick and united action. I think the discussions have underscored that Europe's security, competitiveness, and resilience are all at stake in navigating China relations and a likely further deterioration of US-China relations. I would like to thank all of our panelists for contributing to this debate, helping us to provide a solid grounding for launching into this critical Yeah, it is our task to provide you with the best possible analysis of structural and shorter-term trends that shape China's trajectory and how it impacts Europe. And we do so best together with fantastic partners, including Politico, our Horizon Europe Consortium, and many others, including in the audience. So thank you again for joining today. We can announce already today that next week will obviously be exciting, not just because of the inauguration of the next US president, but also because we have a, if you wish, counter proposal for you on Monday afternoon, where we will be hosting again the German foreign minister to discuss geopolitical developments in the context of China. And we look forward to sharing that and other insights with you in the coming weeks and months. Thank you so much for joining the MERICS China Forecast 2025. Have a fantastic afternoon and see you very soon. Goodbye.